lovely to introduce Fee, who is, do you want to introduce yourself, Fee?
Yeah, the reason why I'm here is because I was involved with All Souls Church over on the Isleworth border in Hounslow, and I set up some projects, one of which is the food bank on the Ivy Bridge estate, which is the large social housing estate that was attached to the church. I'm now 4 weeks into a placement as an ordinand over in another church in Hounslow. So yeah, that's St Mary's. So still kind of working in this sort of remit, but in quite a different way now.
Brilliant, lovely. And we're going to hear a bit more about your journey on the Ivy Bridge estate and what you learnt there shortly. So what I'm going to do first of all, I'm going to go through a real basic, I've got a PowerPoint, apologies, I hate them too, but sometimes they're a good way to get information over. I'm going to attempt to share my screen now, and I'm going to start the PowerPoint. And if it's awful and it's horrible, I will just talk. Brilliant. So we're going to do sort of 10 minutes now, really basic about what is Universal Credit and how can we help people. And then we'll talk to Fee a little bit about putting that into practice. So I'm going to start off thinking about this is what we're going to cover. What is a benefit system? What is Universal Credit? Why now? Why are we thinking about it now? Who can apply for it, and what ways can we help people? Just as a caveat, I have done quite a lot of training around Universal Credit in the last 2 or 3 years. We're not going to go into huge amounts of detail like I did on those trainings just because of time, but we can put on some more training if that is useful. So we'll talk about that at the end. I'm very happy to follow up if there's enough interest. We can do another sort of 2-hour sessions on the sort of more detailed aspects of it. We're just going to look really today at focusing practically on what we can do to help people. It is rapidly changing, Universal Credit. It's less rapidly changing than it was about 3 months ago, but particularly during COVID, it has changed. So some of the stuff is general and some of it may be not quite right for now, but it may change. So just be aware that this is a general picture rather than specific detailed policy that may or may not change. Also, I'm not a welfare benefit advisor. And actually so I'm coming very much the generalist, but that's the idea, because actually you're probably not a welfare benefit advisor either, and actually you shouldn't be. And the whole point about this session is we shouldn't be giving out money advice to people. Our roles in the community is to support, encourage, facilitate, get alongside, accompany people, but we're not, unless you're qualified to do so, we shouldn't be giving out money advice. So there's no pressure today that you're going to come away and be expected to sort someone's benefits out. Actually, our jobs, hopefully, as we're going to come on to, are about supporting people on that. And then if we need to, then our job is then to refer on to somebody who is qualified. So there's no expectation that you should be taking on more than you're able to. So just to caveat that at the beginning. So the benefit system, I decided I'd try and draw a diagram of a benefit system. This was a bad idea, but this is my attempt. It's not entirely comprehensive, but just to talk about the benefits generally, people can get benefits if they are in certain categories. I've sort of separated it into 3 categories. There's probably ones that I'm missing, apologies. But the in-work benefits, which is a big blue circle, that's basically almost anyone who's of working age, which is 18 to 65, is able to apply for those benefits. Whether they get much is another question, but they can apply for those. Then you have the benefits that you can apply for if you have a disability or medical condition, or you're caring for someone who does. And they're not always to do with whether you're actually in work or not. So people might be receiving them and working and actually, or not, depending. And then there's also some other benefits that you get if you can't work. It may be to do with your life stage or age or whatever. So things like pension credit and child benefit. Obviously, child benefit goes to an adult, but it's really there for a child to support them, and things like maternity pay. So what we're going to look at today is the big blue circle, the in-work benefits. There is quite a lot of overlap, and the reason I mention it is you might end up supporting people who are applying for several of these things. And you might have someone who's on a disability benefit who also applies for Universal Credit or one of the in-work benefits. And that often is quite common for people to have more than one, but they're administrated separately. So if you look at each of those circles, they have a separate administration process. So if you were going to help someone go through, for example, disability living allowance application, that would be very different to the in-work benefits. So we're just going to look at the in-work benefits today, and we'll come on to why we're doing that in a minute. Is that all clear? Does that make sense? And I say I may well have missed benefits off there, so please let me know if I have. But this is my rough eye, just to show you that there are different pots. And we often find, particularly, I don't know what you found, Fee, but I find people who have got PIP, and DLA also get universal credit. So they're often the common overlap. So universal credit, what is it? You may have heard about it lots. It's a new, I say new, it's been in since 2013, but it's been a very, very slow rollout. It's a means tested system to deliver benefits for those of working age is the general phrase. So 18 plus, who can either be out of work, but you can also be on low income. So it's not just people who are looking for work. It might be people who are in work, but in insecure work or low paid work. You may have heard of some of the square boxes around the edge. JSA, Job Seekers Allowance, ESA's Employment Support Allowance. You may have heard of housing benefit, you may have heard of tax credits, child tax credit and income support. They're all benefits that people can currently get, but they are going to be phased out. They're called legacy benefits. And the idea is eventually everybody on any of those benefits will all receive universal credit. So any of those benefits make up universal credit. So if you're a new applicant, you wouldn't apply for housing benefit anymore. You'd go straight onto universal credit. If you're a parent you would who went into low paid work, you wouldn't apply for child tax credit. You'd go onto universal credit. And slowly everyone's getting migrated onto universal credit. And universal credit is different to those 6 benefits because it's administrated as one central pot and it's paid monthly in arrears. And if you are familiar with any of the other benefits, they are all administrated differently. They have different amounts of time. Sometimes you get them 2 weekly, sometimes you get them monthly, sometimes you get them 4 weekly. This is basically a one lump sum paid in arrears. And that is what universal credit is. So the idea is eventually everybody will be on universal credit and the others will cease to exist. So the universal credit is quite a massive change from the current benefit system. And this actually probably isn't a huge shock for people who haven't ever experienced the benefit system because they haven't known anything else. But if you have currently experienced the benefit system, universal credit will be a big transition for you. If, for example, you're already on income support or you're already receive housing benefit. The changes are that it's online only. You can't go to a job centre and apply unless you're extremely vulnerable or you're in a specific category, but almost everybody is online only. So you have to be able to do it online, and you also have to be able to constantly chat to people online as well. So it's not just a one-off online. You have to have a computer, you have to have internet access regularly. It's paid in arrears monthly. There's been a big, I think that's quite well publicised, which means particularly for your first payment, you have a 5-week wait. So that's a big campaign that's been going on recently about whether that could be brought down. But you get a lump sum at the end of the process of applying every month. It has to be paid into a bank or credit union account. You can't go and pick it up from anywhere. You have to have an account to have it paid into. The rent is paid to the tenants, not the landlords, and that's a huge change for many people. Housing benefit traditionally and previously mostly goes direct to the landlord, so the tenant doesn't ever see it. But if you go into universal credit, you will receive your lump sum rent, and then you're expected to pay your landlord. And this is causing quite a lot of problems for people, particularly who are vulnerable, particularly people who are struggling for money. Because if someone puts, for example, in London, your rent might be, £800-900 a month. If someone puts that into your bank account and you haven't eaten very much recently, you might use that for food and not for rent. So there's a big question there about whether that and how we can help people around that, to think about that. And the other thing is it's a payment monthly to couples and households. You don't get individuals payments, you get payments to a household. And so therefore the whole household income is taken into account when you are thinking about what you're going to receive. You get something called a UC award, interesting language. You would get how much, everyone gets different amounts. And it's very, very complicated to work out how much everyone's going to get. So it's not a standard rate of like £74 a week. It all depends on how many households, how many are in your household, how many dependent children, where you live, because it's all based on the local housing allowance, what your household income is already. So if you're already working, things that will be factored in. Deductions that may be taken off for any debts that you owe, and also what savings you have. It's assessed each month, and every month you get an email the week before your award telling you what you're going to get that month. So people who are on variable incomes, for example, if you're a builder or a plumber and you get some work in one month and not another, your amount of universal credit will change each month because of that. So you expect to apply online. This is the process. You apply online. Sorry about the typo. I just realised I did this last night quite late. So you have to verify your ID online as well, which I don't know whether Fee will talk about, but that's sometimes a bit of a problem for people because you have to have the right documentation. You're then expected to either go to a job centre or have a telephone conversation with a claimant commitment. This has all been changed during COVID, and it's different in different places. So that's a slightly awkward one in that things may or may not have changed, but you're expected to sort of sign something to say, I'm willing to do this in order to receive the benefit. You then have to complete what's called a journal, useful, important word to know, as what they call the online sort of page where you have to record what you're doing to look for work, and any problems you might have. That's where you have a conversation with your what's called a work coach, who's the person at the DWP who you're assigned, and they will say things like, you know, have you done this, or could you send me this piece of information, and you're expected to do that online. And you get sanctioned if you don't fill in the journal and you break your claimant commitment. So if they say you need to come to a meeting to prove that you have 3 children and you don't turn up to that meeting, you can get sanctioned for that, which means taking away some of your money. So that's when you maybe hear about sanctions, that's what happens. So that's the general process of going through Universal Credit. Apologies, this is a whistle-stop tour, but I really want to get on to hearing more about Bee's experience. So I hope that's sort of the basic steps that you do if you're applying for Universal Credit. And if you have got questions or comments, do put them in the chat as I talk, if you've got things that come up. So who can apply for it? And this is why Universal Credit we're talking about now. It's basically for anyone of working age. There are some exceptions. For example, if you're coming out of foster care, you don't apply till you're 21, but basically working age 18 to 65, or you're in a partnership with someone who is a working age. So if you're pension age but you're married to someone who's younger, or in a partnership with someone who's younger, then you'll get Universal Credit. You have to have a right to work in the UK, and you also have to have less than £16,000 in savings, and the more savings you have, the less money you get. And when you get to 16,000, you get nothing. Basically, that's the tail off point. So, and it can be anybody, it can be anyone who's not working, but it also can be that you're in work on low pay, and in London, because housing costs are so high, actually to be on low income actually isn't that large. It can be quite a large amount you're bringing in, and you can still be eligible, so it's definitely worth checking, because housing costs are so high in London. It can be for those with any number of children. You may have heard that it was only for people with 2 or less children, but now they've expanded the system, so it's anybody. So basically it's anybody can apply, who otherwise would be trying to work. So at the moment, when we're thinking about redundancies and people losing hours at work and with COVID, this is the benefit that people will be applying for. And this is why it's so important. There has been some time limited support, as we know, the furlough scheme, the self-employed scheme, but actually Universal Credit is the great sort of catch-all for everybody. So whenever you say, what am I going to do? The final sort of net is, well, you can apply for Universal Credit. So that's why it's really important that we need to know about it now, because there may be people who otherwise would never have thought they'd ever have to access the benefit system who are now having to apply for Universal Credit. And just to show the scale of the problem, as I say, Universal Credit was rolled out in 2013, and it's taken 7 years to get to the stage where 3 million people registered for it. And in 6 months, it's gone up to 6 million. So it's doubled during lockdown. So suddenly the system is creaking and struggling, because obviously a huge number more people are applying for it than they ever have done before. So yeah, and actually we're expecting more, because I think the furlough scheme ends at the end of October, and there's going to be huge numbers of more redundancies going on. So there'll be another surge in applications, and I think I read something that Step Change we're expecting the peak of applications to be January 2021. So this is not going to go away anytime soon. The other thing that's interesting is that 26% of new claimants are from a sort of management background, so people who the system wasn't designed for professional type levels of income, and because there was no expectation that they'd be having to claim Universal Credit. And there's a lot of people who are struggling to experience the benefit system. So that's another issue why it's really important to know about. And actually, it's just, I've got to be honest, it's a pittance to live on. It's really hard. It's not generous at all in terms of how much you have to live on. So for some people, it'll be a huge shock to have to manage that. So I think those on Universal Credit saw their income dip by 47% when they went from a salary to income to Universal Credit. Very briefly, just how COVID has changed Universal Credit. There is some good news. During lockdown, the Chancellor announced that there has been some improvements in the amounts of money that's given. So the basic allowance has been increased by 20%, £20 a week But if you're on low income, that's enormous. It's absolutely huge, and that's been really significant. The other thing that's affected London a lot is the local housing allowance have been increased. I can talk about that at a later date. It's a bit complicated, but basically they pay a bit more for your housing. Is the general, it was 10% and now it's 30%. So the 30th percentile is 30% of properties in they will pay for in the general market. And then also the minimum income floor has been removed. Again, technology jargon you probably don't need to know, but it just means previously people who are self-employed found it very difficult to get anything on Universal Credit, and they've taken that away to make it easier for self-employed people to apply. So they're the big changes that have happened, and they will continue till March 2021. There is a huge campaign brewing at the moment, if you're interested in this, if you're a social justice warrior, to try and continue the £20 increase beyond March 2021 on the basis that it's made a massive difference, and is it possible to continue that? And I think also looking at the local housing allowance rates, whether they could be continued to be increased. So that will go on, and that will, I guess, will come to a peak at some point in the spring when the government will make a decision on that. So thinking very practically about how we help people navigate this, if they've lost their job or they've lost income or they're really worried about money, what can we do? As I say, as a diocese, we've been working, helping support people around Universal Credit. There's some brilliant parishes doing some amazing stuff, and we've been doing this for about 18 months. And based on the experience of previous priests that I've spoken to and workers, and we'll hear from Fee in a minute, I think there's various things that we can do to get alongside people without needing to do the money advice bit. I think gathering documents, just being around to support people emotionally, with online applications. There's the IT and online side of it. It's a bit harder when we're not able to meet so easily together. And then there's a sort of advocating with people. So when they have to go to meetings or they have to have phone calls, making sure that you're able to be there with them to help them explain themselves and get the information over that they need to. One of the big issues with Universal Credit is there's no translation. So if you don't speak very good English, it's really hard to navigate the system. So if you have people who have English or literally struggles, then it's good to help them along with that. A big thing we can do is signpost, and we're going to come on to that shortly. And then there's a whole question about how do we help people if they are in that 5-week wait without any money. So I'm going to ask Fee a couple of things about this, but just thinking about how we help people, just to reiterate, we just need to make sure if we're helping people with money, it's about them making the choices that they want to do about their money. They must always be the ones to decide what they want to do and how they do things. So it's really important that in terms of safeguarding and protecting both the people that we're helping, but also ourselves, that we are above board and make sure we are really clear about what we can and can't do. So particularly it's difficult when you're dealing with someone who's vulnerable, who may have English as a second language, or who maybe have some learning disabilities, those kind of things. It's about making sure that if you're helping someone to make decisions about what they do, that they are giving as much informed consent as possible. And so we might come on to that a bit later if that's an issue. But our main job is really if we can signpost people to those who can help, and making sure we know the right places to signpost. So yeah, helping people. How are we doing time-wise? What are we on? I think I might stop here. I've got a few slides here about some things that we can do to help, but I really want to hear, I think, a bit more from Fee. So I will, if we have time, I'll finish these, but the rest of the slides are really just facts about how we can help and where we can signpost people to. So I will stop there now, and I'll send the slides around, and if we have time after I've talked to Fee, I can go through them again. Is that all right? Is that okay? I feel like I've just talked forever. Lovely, great. So what I'll do now is, Fee, you're happy to unmute. Do you want to talk a little bit? I mean, that was a very whistle-stop tour, and I'll have a look at some of the questions. But do you want to talk a little bit about what your experience has been like? So you have been working in Hounslow Borough, which was a pilot area to roll out. So you've had Universal Credit for longer than most.
It was indeed.
And talk to me about how that all came about through Ivy Bridge and your experience on with the setting up.
So when I started working, I was given the task of starting some midweek projects on the Ivy Bridge estate. And so I kind of went around local agencies, and one being a children's centre who said they really needed a food bank there, having to bus people down to Feltham. So I thought, okay, well, we'll set up the food bank. I don't want this to be a long-term thing. I said at the time. I felt that, you know, our welfare system should be able to give people the amount they need to live on. People shouldn't be food banks, and I still feel that now. So I'm always sort of passionately against food banks, although I realise that you know, we desperately need them at the moment, and with the best will in the world, some of these Universal Credit with a 5-week wait, you know, it's based on a pattern of people that have some savings. The people that we are dealing with, or coming to the food bank, for instance, you know, don't have the luxury of having savings or being able to build up any savings. They're living sort of hand to mouth generally. So when we set up, I thought let's find out why people are coming along, because I can't support people or find out why they're there. And so we ended up sort of developing a drop-in around the food bank. And I think one of the key things on doing this sort of work is having some sort of presence where people can get to know you. So having the drop-ins was a brilliant person from the church.
It keeps going a bit juddery and jittery and a little bit breaking up, but we're catching the gist of it. So I think keep talking.
Okay. So I decided I had a choice of signing up with a local borough food bank or with a Trussell Trust, and I went with a Trussell Trust because I thought, right, these guys are collecting data nationwide and can feed back government. So where things were kind of perhaps slipping up in the whole welfare process. Obviously Hounslow was one of the initial boroughs for UC switch, as Alison has said. And initially we did get, you know, a lot of coming in because of this 5-week wait. And then I have various stories of people that we then supported. I don't know if you want me to go straight into that, Alison.
And you could talk, a little bit about the sort of people who were coming and then what you did, I suppose.
Yeah. So as I said, we sort of gradually built up relationships. So it's always important to have some sort of drop-in or vehicle whereby people know you were there and operating, however that works in your local setting. And then, you know, people knowing that you are trustworthy, that you've got policies in place, that sort of thing. And so some of the people we got to know, for instance, there was one guy who lives locally, and I'd met him previously, but he had been sent a letter to switch to UC, and he'd sort of collected up what I find is people, if they're slightly vulnerable, will just collect up the paper. And he kind of came in with an envelope stuffed full of different letters that he'd got, and wondered why he wasn't getting his any benefits at the time. And then we realised he sort of missed the deadline for actually signing up for UC, or he should have done that. And of course, he doesn't have a smartphone, doesn't have access to a computer, and we had a small computer set up in the drop-in that's useful to again have access to something. It can be a tablet, can be a smartphone, you can do it from your own smartphone. And then we said, right, we better sign you up then for UC. So I just took him in hand and did that for him. And there's not, you know, the first stage of signing up for UC, you don't need terribly personal information, but obviously you've got a GDPR situation now. Someone's got to confirm that they're happy for you to know that information. You're not keeping, you're inputting it. And in this case, I was just helping him input it so that he could get to the point where he had an appointment. The next stage of that was I needed to make sure he got to that appointment. So again, just slightly on the vulnerable side, long-term alcoholism. And so I was able to go along to the appointment and explain to the person at the appointment that he was going to struggle with all the online and needed special support in that situation. That was one example. And then another lady who's from Bangladesh, she came to me in a panic because her husband was due to have an appointment. They'd signed up for Universal Credit. They they'd gone through the system. I think her daughter initially had helped her. But often, again, if people in a slightly vulnerable situation or have English as another language, they might just suddenly realise there's an appointment due, they can't get there, what do they do? So we were able to, she was able to get her login details from her daughter, and then we looked at her journal and I was able to write in there the situation with her husband. So her husband was ill, couldn't make this appointment. And it's just a sense of relief people have when somebody just writes something as simple as just writing in this online journal, can't make this appointment. But if you don't make the appointment, what happens? You get sanctioned. And so what I'm finding is with Universal Credit, that it's always the people that are slightly more vulnerable that get hit worst by it because of all these systems. And so just briefly touching on the current situation, you're more likely to get people that they may have been in low paid or administration jobs maybe, or management, but they're going to have some knowledge of how to use systems. They probably will have access to a smartphone. So from that point of view, things may be a little easier. But I do worry, particularly in London situation. And I think even 30 percentile doesn't seem an awful lot. Look at some of the rents in London, and I think that is going to be a huge problem. And that is something that I would sort of pass over to Eddie, I think. Eddie, you still there, I think, somewhere?
Yeah.
And I think, the key thing to say with Universal Credit is it's fairly user-friendly, and don't be scared of it. So long as you've got those sort of policies, safeguarding policies in place, etc., where you can support someone, log on for them if they're happy for you to have the details. Go through the journal, describe, what they need to write in the journal. And what I have found is communication is key. So whether it's using the journal or whether it's phoning, make those phone calls. If someone's happy for you to do that, don't be scared, just get in touch, because communication is often key. The other thing that's been really, really good is having a network of agencies around and advise people that we can discuss with signpost too. So I think I know Eddie quite well, and we've worked together quite a bit over the years. So I would say, look at your local area and see what agencies are there. It's really key to kind of have toing and froing. Sometimes you need to build up a network of people around someone. So if somebody's clearly struggling to survive on Universal Credit, something's wrong and they do need to speak to a proper advisor, or they may need some more sort of personal support if they're not managing. There's all sorts of different sort of support out there. And
I think
similarly
I think one of the things you were saying was that it wasn't something like you'd gone off and done loads of training as a money person or anything. You almost sort of
that's the thing. I said, my only experience of benefits prior to starting the drop-in was my own sort of signing on when I was about 19, I think, briefly. I had no experience at all, and I was probably, maybe like a couple of you here, a little bit reticent and a little bit worried about, the world of official online applications. And as Liz knows, we've subsequently, and I think she's been involved in this as well, helping people apply for PIP, that is quite a form, and you do have to kind of know a little bit about that in order to apply correctly for those. We've even ended up going along to being interviews as well. So you learn as you go along, but it's not being scared to make those first steps and get in touch and find out, because the chances are you've got more confidence than the person, that I've found out so much through talking to housing departments and WP, you sort of just find out and you get a bit more confident. I don't need to know all the finance details. Like Alison said, I am not a finance advisor. Having said that, if someone survives on the money they've got, something's wrong. That's my kind of my basic statement.
Yeah, that's actually a good thing. So actually, it's not, once you get to the stage where people are not surviving on what they've got, then that's when you go, right, I need to pass this over, or I need someone else to take over from that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it may be, you know, it can be for a variety of reasons. It could be because of mental well-being. It could be because some error with the finance. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, there's various reasons that I found. Okay. And one other story that I have is a gentleman who was very vulnerable, and in the end actually was trying to encourage his daughter to support him with the Universal Credit, and she was updating his journal and got quite feisty on it as well. You know, she'd really put what she felt on this journal sometimes. But, you know, empowering people to use it and not to be scared of it, but actually, this is what's going on, and, you know, this is a problem, and being honest about that. Because often people are sort of a little bit too scared of EP advisors or so forth. But as I said, if someone is struggling, they're struggling and they need support. So,
absolutely. So actually, your role really,
no one should be penalised for being vulnerable.
I'm aware there's a bit of a delay and a bit of a breaking up, so I might come to you with questions. No, that's really helpful. All that you've shared has been brilliant. I think what I take from what you've said is that actually it's about relationship. It's about the relationships you have with people and not being an expert, but actually it's not as scary as people think. But perhaps because, I don't know about you, but if you've ever had any money problems, you just want to ignore it. You just want to like hide it away, and having someone else go, I'll open those envelopes for you. Actually, let's open these and look at them together is quite, or let's try and do this online together. Having someone alongside you then might be the thing that makes the difference actually, but not needing to know all the detail, knowing where to refer on to, and then not being that expert, you're actually being the friend.
Yeah, exactly. And not being, you know, afraid to make a call for them and sort of find out what someone says. I mean, I've ended up sort of discussing all sorts of areas I have no idea about, but through a phone call and through chatting to someone, you learn. So yes, that happens constantly. And I always found, you know, we used to have a Wednesday project, which was a multicultural project. And there's people with many different languages in the Ivy Bridge estate. And they would just, again, they'd come with an envelope full of pieces of paper and just go, there you go. What?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's going to be interesting about Universal Credit going forward is actually there's going to be lots of different issues with it. I think up until now, it's mostly people on very low income applying for it. So things like online access, confidence digitally has been a problem. But like if people are applying for it now, who maybe, like you say, have been in managerial jobs or whatever, or maybe even just low pay but in an office, the actual administration of it isn't difficult. It's more the living on the money that you get, understanding how that works, and perhaps and the housing cost is huge.
I have big concerns about the housing costs, and I've already come across people somebody is going short themselves because they're trying to help their daughter out paying rent, because private rents are substantially more than the subsidised social housing. So what you generally find is people that transferred to UC back during the pilot were actually, once it was all sorted out, the money's not great, but they could survive because the rent's factored in already. That was the rent that the sort of council were expecting to pay. Because if you've got somebody who's paying, you know, I don't know, $1,500 a month rent, that's well above the cap. So that for me is a big area of concern going ahead. And I would like to see, you know, this, like I said, the 30% outlets. It may cover some, but I imagine, people trying to pay mortgages, etc. I'm not sure what's going to happen with that.
I think so, absolutely.
I think that is an area to cover.
Definitely, and I think that's a huge issue because people haven't chosen their housing based on what the local housing cap would be. And then they're suddenly found they're taking short.
And another thing is that when I first started, there were discretionary grants handed out by local boroughs, which were really useful when something had just happened, or, you know, people, white goods problems, that sort of thing. But that got cut. I think they're bringing that back in again. But my concern is the dramatic increase in people using food banks, and, you know, again, that it should be an absolute emergency, not something that we rely on as a country. And I would really like to see more advocacy on behalf of people, because I don't want to, you know, it feels like begging almost, having to go to a food bank. That's what a lot of people say. They feel embarrassed about being there. And so it's not a great thing for them. It's much better that we can sort of support them properly through welfare means.
Absolutely.
So I would always encourage people to be lobbying their local MP, that sort of thing as well.
Absolutely. And perhaps this may raise the awareness of how the benefit system operates to people who maybe otherwise haven't. So I think that's a really good point. Even if you're in an area where you're not necessarily affected right now, looking at the system and saying, can we make this a better system so we don't have to have food banks? And I know that Trust are doing a big campaign at the moment, and if you want to get involved in that, it's great. They're looking at, I mean, their big argument is no one comes to a food bank because they haven't got food, it's because they haven't got money to buy food. So it's looking at the root causes of that. So if that's an area that you're interested in, please do check them out, and I'll send some information around afterwards. I will send all this stuff around afterwards, so please, if it's useful to take notes, great, but I will send the slides around afterwards. I'm aware we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd like to get back onto a couple of things, a couple of places to refer people to, because I think one of the key things is, even if you can do nothing else, knowing somewhere to signpost that's a safe, good place to signpost is really important. So I'll come on to that shortly, but I do also, we've got quite a lot of sort of questions, so I'm just going to rattle through those now, and the ones that are in the chat. If anyone's got anything else they want to say, or comments or thoughts, then if you want to, once I've done the questions, just put your hand up and wave, and then I'll unmute you, and then we can ask the questions. There's a few sort of practical questions. I think Temi was saying, what's the cut-off point for savings? It's 16,000. So if you have £16,000 or more in savings, and that's household savings, so it might just be you, it might be a partner that you live with as well, then you don't get anything. But even if you have some savings, so you have £4,000, £5,000, £6,000, your universal credit will be reduced. So from basically, the more savings you have, the more your universal credit comes down. And then when you get to 16,000, you get nothing. And that is a big problem for some people who have been saving for house deposits, and then suddenly they lose their jobs, and that house deposit means that they're going to get nothing. Or they might be putting money aside for a tax bill, and that all gets taken into account. I think the other question as well was whether that's also including housing. That 16,000 doesn't include money that you have in equity in a house. So if you own your own house, you've got a mortgage, they won't look at what you've got on that mortgage, but the universal credit, just to be clear, doesn't pay a mortgage, so you're not going to be able to pay off the capital of that mortgage with universal credit. So it's a bit of a complicated system, and what I'd suggest is, if you're interested in knowing how things work, I'm going to go back to my slides. How to help people. I'm just going to scroll through. There's an online benefit checker. It's quite complicated what people are eligible for, but either of these two are free and up to date and really good and really helpful. So even if you just sit with somebody and want to help them or do this over the phone, we've had people doing sort of phone coaching, sit with someone and just work out, what are you entitled to? What are you likely to get when you put all the information in? It will tell you what you're entitled to. So I'd really recommend those as good places to go to. Again, just knowing that they're there and being able to do that. So that's the savings. I hope that answers the savings questions. I think, I can't remember who it was said, has it been rolled out nationally? Yes. So before COVID hit, Universal Credit is now operating nationally across the UK in every job centre, and you now can't apply for the other benefits. You automatically go onto Universal Credit. So the pilot's been very slow, but it's now national. And the idea was, allegedly, before COVID hit, that in 2020, they were going to start, so all new claimants have been going on to Universal Credit for a while, and the summer 2020 was the point at which we were going to start migrating people on. So people who'd been on housing benefit or tax credits for years were then going to get transferred onto Universal Credit, and that was the big thing. I think that's been scrapped. I'm guessing that's been scrapped. So I must find out actually what's happening with that. But yes, the idea is it is all happening nationally. Right, so I was just looking. Now, Debbie Thomas was saying that you'd had someone apply for UC and the rent had gone direct to the landlord?
Yeah, I mean, literally, she just texted me the other day, and I've actually got it here, and it actually says this will be paid to the landlord. So I don't know whether that's a COVID process or not, but it actually says X amount will be paid straight to your landlord, which I think is a good thing, actually.
That might well be a COVID thing. There is something slightly more complicated, something you can apply for if somebody is in certain categories. you can apply for something called an alternative payment arrangement. And again, we can go through more on this if people want to do a detailed training on Universal Credit. But people can then, one of the things of an alternative payment arrangement you have to apply for, but one of the things you can say is this person needs their rent paid to their landlord. You have to apply for it, and then the landlord has to agree it. Eddie, do you know anything about that? Do you know what's happening? Have you heard anything about that?
Alternative payment arrangements have been around for a long time. I'm not aware of any specific change in policy during COVID, but then it's very difficult keeping up to date with all of the changes. But landlords can apply for it themselves, in particular if you're 8 weeks in rent arrears.
So as soon as you get into rent arrears, landlords can ask for it to be done automatically.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there are lots of good reasons why you can apply for an alternative payment arrangement. It doesn't happen automatically. You have to ask for it. So it'd be interesting, Debbie, to find out whether your clients applied for what's called an APA or whether it's just happened.
Yeah, no, a friend of hers just said you could qualify for Universal Credit. She did, and then she just got a note saying we will pay £400 to your landlord on the 27th of October. So
brilliant.
I don't know.
Right. Well, it's not. It's good to know the system is working.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Brilliant.
Just to double check, so savings. So for your pension is being paid by work. So maybe you're in employment. How to explain it? So your employer is contributing towards your pension. Does that pension count as savings for Universal Credit?
No, is that right, Eddie? I think that's the right one.
I just wanted to clarify that.
If it's in a pension scheme, it's separate. But say you might be freelance and you've been putting aside a couple of thousand for your, it's the household savings basically. So pensions are secure and safe and separate. Yeah, brilliant. I'll just briefly explain a little about housing. I'll go on, Tim. Go for it.
Local housing allowance, you can look it up online. Key in the postal code and is 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, etc., etc. That can be. There is a site for that I've used.
Brilliant.
How much housing element you're entitled to for that area.
I should put that in the email as well. That's a really good point. So yes, the way that how much housing they pay is worked out is there's something called a local housing allowance, LHA. It's different for each. London is split into zones. The country is split into zones, and there's just a set amount that is paid for that area. Some boroughs have more than one zone. I know Hounslow, where I live, we have inner London and outer London within the same borough. So depending on where you live, you can find out what your local housing allowance is, and that's the amount that the benefit will pay for your housing. And when you go on to that, you'll see that it's not market rate basically at all. It's the local. It's what the benefit system agrees they will pay towards housing. It used to be set at 10%, I think, of average market, and now it's a 10% of the market. So if you had 100 houses on the market, you could afford 10 of them on the local housing allowance rate. Now it's gone up to 30%. So now if you're on the sort of lowest 30% of houses in your area should be eligible to have your housing paid. Otherwise, you get some money towards it and you're expected to find the rest. So you can imagine somebody who's doing very well, hires a nice 1 or 2 bedroom flat somewhere like Camden, is going into work every day, suddenly loses their job, and their local housing allowance might be 1/3 of their rent. So they've then got to find the rest of the rent very quickly. So that's the problem that Fee was talking about, that people haven't chosen their housing assuming that they're going to have to ask the local housing allowance for that. So yeah. And then one other thing Eddie's just reminded me of, which is very important, actually, the other thing that isn't included in Universal Credit is council tax reduction. And you have to apply for that separately. So if somebody's on Universal Credit suddenly, you can actually get a reduction on your council tax, but you have to apply to your local authority for that. Universal Credit is administrated centrally by the Department for Work and Pensions, and council tax is administrated by your local council. So if you do know somebody on Universal Credit going on to it, a really good question to ask is, have you applied for council tax reduction? Is that all right, Eddie? I said the right things?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Wonderful. So that's just another little thing that we can do. And again, I'll put this in the email afterwards. You're not expected to know all this off by heart. You're not expected to be the person who is the expert. I think we're just really saying that it's about, don't be scared to think about just helping somebody with the application. And if they're worried, sometimes it's just talking about it. It helps massively. So yeah. So I mean, we can just to round up, because I'm aware we're nearly finished time-wise. But if there's any other questions, please do get in touch with me. I'm sure Fee would be very happy to talk about her experience a bit more and guiding through that as well. There's people who here on the call have done Universal Credit applications and have do it quite regularly, so there's plenty of expertise if you need it. If it's helpful, we 18 months ago we ran sessions for training for clergy and laity for each of the diocesan areas, just as a basic primer about what Universal Credit is. I'm really happy to run some of those again. And if that's interesting to you, it's called UC Savvy, is the 2-hour sort of training that I've done before. I'm really happy to do that again. So if that's helpful and you want more information than this scratch the surface, then let us know in the feedback, and we will start looking if there's enough people we can create do an online couple of hours on that sometime in the next few months. But yeah, so I'm aware this is very, it's a very big topic, and as soon as you start getting into the details, there's a lot of questions. So yes, there's a couple other questions just at the end. Are there leaflet about council tax reductions available from local authorities? There probably should be. I'm not sure. You're in Hammersmith and Fulham, aren't you, Ben? Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but I'd certainly, the council should have some stuff around it, because it should be, so it might be worth finding out from probably your housing team, because they'd be the ones who administrate it, and then just having those around and letting people know about them, because it is a benefit that people miss quite often. And the final question, Debbie Lawrence said, how discretionary housing payments. Is that what you were talking about, Fee?
Yeah, I wasn't sure they were still doing them, and also the trouble is you can't continue to apply and it will still only be a certain amount. So I think there is a big headache coming with end of furlough scheme and people trying to pay rents and mortgages. I don't know.
So in case you hear that phrase, discretionary housing payment, DHP, every council, well, not every council, councils tend to have a pot of money that they're able to do one-off payments to people who are in hardship or in for whatever reason. So perhaps if someone's having to move house and they haven't got costs and they're very low income, you can apply for a discretionary housing payment. Not every council has it. Different ones of different councils have operated that system differently. So this is the problem, it's very patchy, but it's worth seeing. Again, if you're talking about council tax reduction, ask about discretionary housing payments at the same time. But it is only a one-off payment. It's a pot of money that councils have to help people tide them over a big change, for example. So great. Oh, goodness me, we could carry on forever. And I'm really aware that there's many more questions to happen, but it's 12 o'clock now. So I'd love to just say thank you so much, Fee. Thank you for being with us. I feel like it's a shame about the internet connection, but I think we picked up all that you were saying, so it's fine. Really helpful to know, and we'd love to carry on in this conversation. If you need to know anything more, please let us know, and let me know in the feedback. I'm going to send an email around shortly with the PowerPoint slides on. At the end of those slides, there's loads of suggestions of places that you might want to refer on to people. So if you need to, if things like citizens advice and what you can go for that. So please do have a look through. I hope that's been really helpful.